Like girls' basketball. Them weren't girl-looking girls in that. It's a bunch of guys loping around, like this. Oh, granted, they didn't slap each other on the fanny. But they were still more or less like guys. I wanted to see those girls that run with their arms like this. Or wear high heels for the jump ball. And change clothes every quarter, those old smelly things. And when they break a nail, you stop, I broke a nail. 5 nails, you're out of the game.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, November the 2nd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots. Let's see, we'll have, instead of Bishop Barron, today we're going to have father-periera, and then Ayn Rand quote of the day, my take, Matt Walsh, and Inside Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Human liberty, and not the machinery of coercion or investment, or even by science itself, is what made for a great enrichment from 1800 to the present. Liberated people devising new technologies and institutions did an amazing job from 1800 to the present and will keep doing it. Liberty will make the enrichment worldwide, and the enrichment will not corrupt the human soul. Deirdre McCloskey. That the world spent many thousands of years in what would be considered poverty conditions on a basic absolute basis is indisputable, and that a consistent and profound increase in the absolute level of riches has been the story of the last 200 years is also indisputable. The correlation here is causation, the advent of liberty, first in Western Europe and then to the shores of the colonies. In those pockets of world geography where liberalism has been unleashed, profound enrichment followed.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane.
Higher education, or the way to rot a society's brain, is through the emotions of its children. As a famous and highly remunerated Hollywood screenwriter, I am nothing if not all about subtext. Subtext is what we pros call that underlying layer of meaning with which we underpin our scripts and novels. The thing we call the story, as opposed to what you proles refer to as the plot. So let me straighten you out right now on the crucial difference between the two, so we're all on the same page going forward. In The Godfather and its two sequels, the plot is this. Vito Corleone sees his mother killed in Sicily, escapes, flees to Manhattan as a kid, meets a couple of characters who will later play important roles in the movie, steals a rug, opens an olive oil business, blah, blah, blah. Plot, blech. Story. Immigrant boy tries to save family in brave new world, condemns his children to eternal hellfire. There. Simple, wasn't it? Same goes for our society. We've kept you clowns focused on the plot, while the story sailed right over your heads. You thought you were watching Thelma and Louise, a travelogue chick pick about two hotties on a road trip from Louisiana, not Texas, to Arizona. Meanwhile, we understood that the movie we were watching was about two wounded birds, both with a wing down, who had to play out their hatred for men by driving their pink Cadillac off the edge of the Grand Freaking Canyon. Made sense to us. Which is why you may have noticed that I've been implicitly celebrating our educational achievements in the foregoing chapters, because without the universities, we could never have come this far this fast. Whether it was Cloward and Piven, or the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, or the armed takeover of the Cornell University campus, we have had so many proud moments in higher education over the last half-century that I hardly know where to begin in celebrating them. But I think all right-thinking people have to agree that the basis for our current cult of nihilism began with the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. No, the Frankfurt School has nothing to do with the space behind the green monster at Fenway Park, where they teach the vendors how to soak those Fenway Franks in water until they're good and soggy, and then stick them in one of those cheesy buns that look like a chunk of Wonder Bread sliced down the middle and immediately come apart in your fingers, especially when you spill beer all over them. Instead, it's a reference to a group of revolutionary geniuses, the cream of German philosophical society, who had made international reputations for themselves at the University of Frankfurt, and then, when the Nazis took power, fled to the United States, where they were welcomed into the highest levels of our educational establishment. Unfortunately for you wingnuts, the Frankfurt scholars, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, Max Horkheimer, and a bunch of other people you've never heard of, like Jürgen Habermas, and some you might have, such as Herbert Marcuse, sprang from a hardcore Marxist-Leninist ideology that called for an unremitting, all-out assault on pretty much every Western value and institution. Like Marx, they regarded religion as the opiate of the masses, and most temporal authority they viewed as equally negotiable. As Marx said, Religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for their real happiness. The demand to give up the illusion about its condition is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions. That's telling them, baby. The slogan, "Question authority," is one of their legacies. At the Institute for Sozialforschung, they made their Marxism explicit. And after they came to America, where they landed at Columbia University, they continued their work of social revolution masquerading as intellectual inquiry, thus lighting the way forward as we seized the institutions in the 1960s and began sucking the life out of them in earnest once we'd received our doctorates and couldn't fake being students anymore. Oddly enough, for a bunch of academic big domes, critical theory means pretty much what it says: an attack on just about everything, including the family, the authoritarian personality, i.e. dad, the patriarchal society, social institutions, religions, the whole 9 Megillas. Critical theory saw itself in opposition to traditional theory, which was basically everything in human history that had come before it. And the amazing thing was that so many people were so filled with hatred and loathing for their own culture that they actually bought into it. Want a taste? Here's Marcuse. Freedom of enterprise was from the beginning not altogether a blessing. As the liberty to work or to starve, it spelled toil, insecurity, and fear for the vast majority of the population. If the individual were no longer compelled to prove himself on the market as a free economic subject, the disappearance of this freedom would be one of the greatest achievements of civilization. Let's try a little Horkheimer on for size. Although most people never overcome the habit of berating the world for their difficulties, those who are too weak to make a stand against reality have no choice but to obliterate themselves by identifying with it. They are never rationally reconciled to civilization. Instead, they bow to it, secretly accepting the identity of reason and domination, of civilization in the ideal, however much they may shrug their shoulders. Well-informed cynicism is only another mode of conformity. And my personal favorite from Adorno: a German is someone who cannot tell a lie without believing it himself. This being academe, critical theory got all wrapped up in talk of Kant's phenomenology and Hegel's dialectic and the finer points of Marxism-Leninism. Academics love to chew the fat about things like this and do it from today until a week from next Tuesday without hardly drawing a breath. But at root it was, and I say this proudly, essentially a Comintern-directed assault on the Western democracies. I mean, if you're going to be a follower of Marx, study at the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. Go head-to-head with the other important socialist ideologies of the day, the Italian Fascisti, and the National Socialist German Workers' Party of Adolf Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg. You might as well go whole hog. See, here's the part you reactionaries never grokked, which is why we've been able to pin Hitler on you for more than half a century. Weimar Republic Germany had not one, but 2 socialist movements battling for supremacy on the left. The communists, led intellectually among others by the Frankfurt School, and Hitler's Nazis. They didn't call it the National Socialist German Workers' Party for nothing. They both opposed not only the tottering republic, but also the Junker establishment that had controlled Germany since Bismarck. It's easy to forget that Germany only became a unified country in 1871. Their battle in the universities and in the streets, red shirts against brown shirts, was the semifinals in the larger struggle against Western democracies, with the winner taking on the real war. The war for the soul of the 20th century and beyond. Hitler and his cohort may have been to the right of the communists, but they were in no sense on the right. Hitler had fought in World War I, was gassed and was awarded the Iron Cross, but he hated the aristocracy, as only an Austrian peasant, whose father was very likely the result of an incestuous union in the backwoods of Linz, could. Born in Braunau am Inn, Hitler could look across the river and see Germany. And like many of the leaders in World War II, he was not really from the country he led. After all, Stalin wasn't Russian, he was Georgian. And Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome, was from Rochester, New York. But there's no patriot like an immigrant patriot. Get it? No matter which side had won the battle for Germany, the ancien regime was going to be stood up against the wall and shot anyway. And a country with no long-standing institutions, besides the Catholic Church in the South and the Lutheran Church in the North, could not long withstand the battering it took. In the end, as we know, the Nazis took Germany, the Marxists took Russia. For a brief period after World War I, Catholic Bavaria became a Marxist state. And that was pretty much that. As further proof of their brothers-under-the-skin bond, Hitler and Stalin stunned the world, and certainly stunned the ranks of the American fellow travelers living and plotting in Greenwich Village, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which gave both sides the license to seize everything in the middle, from Finland and the Baltics to Poland and Romania. Hitler, of course, blew the pact away with Operation Barbarossa, his ill-fated invasion of the heroic Rodina in June of 1941. But that's another movie, as we say in Hollywood. Still, just think. Had Germany gone communist instead of National Socialist and kept its brave avant-garde theorists at home in their cold water flats in Prenzlauer Berg and Schwabing, we could have been decades, maybe even a century from where we are now, critically, theoretically speaking. We could well be living in a very different country today, one in which old-fashioned virtues like God and country were not under open attack, where sexuality was fascistically fixed and not progressively fluid, and where education was about different academic disciplines instead of indoctrination and social revolution. Which brings me to my main point. You've got to watch what's going on at the campuses, in the high schools and the primary grades too, right down to the playgrounds. When the German parents saw all those clean-cut, blue-eyed blondes marching around with their arms in the air, when they weren't merrily tossing books onto bonfires, right then and there they should have known something was up. The National Socialists appealed to disparate groups, including the street-fighting thugs of Röhm's SA and the fresh-faced boys and girls from the gymnasia, roughly akin to our middle school and high school combined, but for smart kids, and the universities. There's no revolutionary like a college kid, fired up with unearned anger and blinded by utter ignorance, that's for sure. And today, some of them are my best friends.
And that was half of Chapter 9, Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left, Rule 11.
Rule 11. Never trust a man who is unwilling to have enemies. Acquiring adversaries and opposition is the unavoidable price of principle. Speaking the truth will earn a man enemies. It is a matter of when, not if. And the louder one speaks, the quicker the adversaries will gather. After all, a man cannot stand and genuflect at once. How can he stand up for truth if he's always bending the knee at the altar of taboo, observing popular pieties, palliating any and all imaginable parties offended? The man of appeasement has no religion. He is a loveless and a heartless creature. Do not befriend him. In his compulsive need to please all sides, the good and the wicked simultaneously, he is incapable of your friendship. The only true loyalty between human beings arises from a mutual, virtuous commitment to the truth. And the man unwilling to have enemies cannot, by definition, commit himself to the truth. Thus, an alternative expression of the same rule reads, a man without actual enemies can have no true friends. Jesus said that if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. While he stated this caution conditionally, he meant it as a guarantee. Christians can neither accommodate nor be accommodated by the world. Simply put, unless the worldly culture hates us, then we are failing at our job. Being God's spies does not mean that we hide our credo, In certain times we mute the source of it, but we never mute the credo itself. The credo is what earns the righteous their enemies. There exist only 3 types of friendship, 2 of which are mere shades of the single true form: true friends, friends of pleasure, and friends of utility. Friendships of utility are the most accidental form of friendship, according to the Aristotelian tradition, because the benefits they confer are material and wholly impersonal. In this case, you play with the kid down the block just because he has a swimming pool, even if you dislike him. Friendships of pleasure qualify as closer to true friendships because such friends are mutually attracted to something personal in one another, not a mere material benefit. However, the desideratum, which mutually attracts friends of pleasure, is not virtue. Only the true sort of friends are mutually attracted by one another's virtue, like iron sharpening iron, as St. Paul writes. Retrogrades, take heart. Audacious, intrepid men live and breathe who are worthy of your friendship, provided simply that you make yourself worthy of theirs. True friendships, as opposed to friendships of utility and pleasure, prove to be rare, but not non-existent. How does one find such men but by flying the banner and the colors of the retrograde? Signal who you are and what you stand for: the truth. You act in the name of St. Michael. You will do your utmost until your dying breath to give aid to the righteous and to vanquish the wicked. Fellow retrogrades in your area will recognize and join you if you're doing your job well.
And that was Rule 11 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
That middle-class voters think much more about than they do the deeper moral crisis in the country. Changing worldviews is a long-term goal, but in the short term, we can still win elections by coming up with real solutions to people's problems, as opposed to a general philosophical discussion around values. When someone's self-interest is at stake, solutions trump values every time. Case in point, there are working-class whites in Ohio who helped George W. Bush win the state twice and John Kasich get elected governor in 2010. But they went for Obama in 2012. They didn't see Obama as a statist putting us on the road to being the next Greece. They saw Obama as the guy that saved Daddy's job at the Chrysler plant and thus kept food on the family's table. Similarly, after the 2006 conflict with Israel that it instigated, Islamic terrorist organization Hezbollah started handing out cash to Lebanese families whose homes were destroyed by Israeli bombing. Again, solutions trump values when self-interest is at stake. Number 6, we're too white. African Americans routinely vote with us on issues like marriage, yet there is almost never any Republican Party follow with them after they do. Romney did worse with Latinos than John McCain did in 2008. The reality is the country is becoming less white, so we're going to have to come up with ways to apply our principles to the needs of non-whites like never before. Now, that doesn't mean we have to pander to them or try to out-amnesty the Democrats, because that will just result in the loss of more liberty and the further erosion of the conservative base, which, frankly, the GOP establishment may want, but it means we may need to take a more measured approach on some hot-button issues. For example, how can we demand that minorities stop seeing government as their primary vehicle to access the American dream when Republicans in the corporate class do it all the time? To ask African Americans to totally abandon programs like affirmative action and Latinos to look the other way while we mass deport some of their family members and friends is unrealistic when we allow Republicrats to get away with using government for their purposes all the time. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Sometimes it's like we're writing the Democrats' campaign commercials for them. Look at Texas, one of the most Republican and conservative states in the country. About 38% of that state's population is Latino. So how are conservatives making gains in a state with such a huge Latino population? And can it be modeled nationally? No one would accuse Texas of being a moderate state. Far from it. Most of us consider it conservative Valhalla. So why not follow its lead? Point 7. Pro-lifers need a plan for ultimate victory. Please stop quoting polls telling me this country is more pro-life than ever before. When Richard Murdoch loses a U.S. Senate seat in a very Republican state for saying that all life, regardless of how it's conceived, is a gift from God and deserves to be protected, then that means we need to be honest with ourselves and stop believing our own fundraising propaganda. Pro-lifers are the largest and most loyal voting bloc the GOP has, yet we have almost nothing to show for it except the carcass of Todd Akin abandoned on the side of the road by the GOP establishment. Now, Akin is not a victim of his own mangled remarks voters held him accountable for. But we were victimized by a party establishment who decided 3 months before the election they'd rather have Harry Reid as majority leader than a good man with a 96% American Conservative Union rating in the House, because there was no way to win the majority in the U.S. Senate in 2012 without winning Akin's race. There was plenty of time to rehabilitate Akin in a very Republican state, but the ruling class piled on Akin instead. I was born to a 15-year-old mom. I have members of my own family who were conceived via these so-called exceptions like rape, incest, life of the mother, fetal abnormality, etc. That too many Republican Party politicians think are therefore okay to kill. If 40-plus years after Roe v. Wade, the culture doesn't believe my own family line, conceived in the horrific and traumatic circumstances pro-life pretenders call exceptions, has the right to live, then we have lost the most crucial moral debate of this age and need to completely reevaluate what we're doing and why we're doing it.
And that was the next part of Chapter 2 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Father Leon Pereira.
No one speaks about hell or the devil more in the Bible than Jesus. No one. And he speaks about him in the passage that you heard today, the evil one. Actually, even in the Our Father, when we say, but deliver us from evil, literally, actually, it says, deliver us from the evil one. And this is how the Orthodox, when they pray the Our Father in English, they actually say, deliver us from the evil one, because they translate it better than us. The evil one does exist, and he has a plan for every single one of us here. He hates us. He hates you tremendously. What does he do? Well, you know his plan of action, or at least you should learn to recognize it. To those who are repenting and trying to go back to God, he wants to shout out their faults, point out all their sins. And then he stirs up people to shout them out.
Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand quote of the day.
Clip you're about to watch is from an interview that took place in 1959. The woman in it is Ayn Rand, the author of Atlas Shrugged, a book that progressives literally cannot stand. And I wonder why.
How do we build roads, sanitation facilities, hospitals, schools? If the government is not permitted to force, if you will, by vote, taxation.
When you admit that you want to take money by force from someone and ask me how are we going to build hospitals or roads, you admit that someone is producing the money, the wealth that will make those roads possible. Now you have no right to tell the man who produced the wealth in what way you want him to spend it. If you need his money, you can obtain it only by his voluntary consent.
Thank you. And now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
Now this. The
president was in Minneapolis, raising campaign money. A rabbi shouted, "I need you to call for a ceasefire." Biden replied, "We need a pause." Sounds like the president is bending to the ceasefire pressure, which is intense. The pro-Hamas lobby in Congress pours on the emotion. Cori Bush is brought to tears. Demonstrators disrupt Congress, chanting, "Ceasefire now, ceasefire now." You hear it on campuses and you hear it on the streets. And then there's this. A Hamas leader tells the world what Hamas really wants. Roll tape.
Israel is a country that has no place on our land. We must remove that country because it constitutes a security, military, and political catastrophe to the Arab and Islamic nation and must be finished. We are not ashamed to say this with full force. We must teach Israel a lesson, and we will do this again and again. The Al-Aqsa flood is just the first time, and there will be a second, a third, a fourth, because we have the determination, the resolve, and the capabilities to fight.
Well now, not exactly a humanitarian, is he? The ceasefire brigade wants to let him and his fellow Jew haters regroup. They want Hamas to return and sweep Israel away. And the administration is bending. Biden says pause. How is that different from a ceasefire? And then he appoints Vice President Harris to lead the fight against Islamophobia. Where does that come from? 60% of all hate crimes are committed against Jews. It is anti-Semitism that's tearing us apart. Let's be clear. The crushing of Hamas has begun. Don't slow it down. Give them the moral and military support they need for a decisive win. Second hour of Varney just warming up.
So there he goes. At the very end, he took a stand. Give them the military. He didn't say should, but that's implied. So way to go, Stuart Varney, on that part of it. The rest of it, you could have done this throughout the entire segment, but at least at the end of this, you did go ahead and take a stand and say that they should get all the time that is necessary to get the job done. Good for you. Credit where credit's due. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I was listening to Matt Walsh on the radio, and he made a mistake nobody should make. He went ahead and helped out his enemy, our enemy, and one of our enemies, and that was Vice President Kamala Harris. She made this claim that the violent incidents against Arabs in this country is up. But she didn't cite a source, right? It's an arbitrary claim. It should be ignored. And one of the ways to ignore it is just ignore it. Another way to ignore it is to deny it. So if you're in the break room at work and somebody comes up and says, "Hey, did you hear that there's an uptick in the number of violent incidents against Arabs in this country?" You'd say, "No, there isn't." Simple as that. What you don't do is what Matt Walsh did. Matt Walsh went and looked it up for her. He went and found some kind of a source. We don't know how good of a source it is, and he really dug deep. Way to go, Matt Walsh. You're now doing the work. Apparently, you don't have enough work to do, Mr. Walsh, and so now you're going to do other people's work. You're going to do the vice president's work. And no, that's not what you do. That's stupid and wrong. They have the burden of proof. Everything is fine until proven otherwise. And making an arbitrary claim is not evidence and it's not proof. Simple as that. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Inside Delta Force by Command Sergeant Major Eric L. Haney, retired.
When film started to come in from the observers, other students would develop it in the sniper flyaway darkroom set up in another room. The photos would be posted along with the building sketches to help build useful information as the situation developed. Then each group settled in and set to work. From our observer positions, we had to label the sides of the building and work on individual sketches of the side of the building we were assigned. We immediately began taking photos of the site, but as Branislav explained, neither sketches nor exposed film would be sent back to the TOC for several hours. Instead, the TOC would have to build its initial picture of the site from our verbal reports over the radio. Bronny came over to my position, and I asked him why we didn't immediately send sketches and exposed film back to the TOC. It seemed to me that it was especially needed just after arrival on the scene. He was ready for me. 2 reasons, he explained. 1, because he wanted the guys manning the sniper TOC to produce a picture of the site based upon our radioed reports. It was a good way to get on the same sheet of music, and it was a good way to practice radio discipline. Second, in the first flush of setting up at a site, people are so busy, there usually isn't a man to spare running back and forth between the various observer positions. And sometimes, depending on the target, we couldn't move between positions without the risk of being spotted. In that case, movement would take place only after dark. We stayed in our positions until 6 o'clock that evening before we broke for the day, and both groups reunited to compare notes. It was uncanny what the guys in the TOC had accomplished. The first prints from the film we had finally sent back were just now coming out of the darkroom, but the target sketch they'd produced, solely from verbal reports, was amazingly accurate. Larry summed up the day for us. Guys, the whole point in what takes place, both here in the TOC and out on site, is to build a body of information you can use to make the best possible decision about when, where, and how to conduct an assault. There is no such thing as a matter too small to be reported and logged. There is no such thing as too much intelligence. We will do everything in our power to make the assaulter's job easier. If we can resolve the situation solely by sniper fire, so much the better. But no matter what, we want to tip the odds in favor of the short gunners when they have to hit the place. Since the cat's out of the bag now with our miniature building, we'll go out to the range for the rest of the week and do the same thing we did today using the facade. The group that was in the TOC this afternoon will be on the line, and you other guys will be the TOC bunnies tomorrow. And since there are no questions, he smiled, I'll see you all here in the morning. That was a really good day's training, I thought, as I drove home that evening. In fact, I think I learned more today than on any other one day of the course. I thoroughly enjoyed that week with Larry and his crew. I gained a whole new appreciation for what the long gunners did and how they went about it. I realized that shooting was only a part of what they did, a vital part to be sure, but not the only part. And I made some new lifelong friends. Things were rocking along now. More and more I was beginning to feel that we were part of the unit. We were still some months from being full-fledged operators, but I felt confident we could function well if called upon. The toughest thing we're ever going to have to do is recover a terrorist-held airplane, explained Colonel Beckwith. We've been working on how to go about it, and so have the British, the Germans, the French, and the Israelis. So far, nobody has a real good grip on the problem. But it's a problem we've got to solve, and we've got to solve it soon. Charlie was dressed in a rather presentable fashion today, and so were the rest of us. We had been told to be in casual dress attire, and had also been given an order against chewing tobacco in the classroom while this particular visitor was with us. The colonel obviously wanted our guest to form a favorable impression of the unit, and that meant we all had to do our part. We didn't want to come across as a bunch of knuckle-draggers. You're going to spend a few days here in the classroom with some visitors, and then go down to Atlanta this weekend for a visit the FAA's helped us arrange with Delta Airlines. Delta has agreed to let us conduct research and training on planes they have in for scheduled maintenance. This will be our first real chance at working with a civil air carrier, so the whole outfit will be coming down too. We want to make the most of this opportunity. I want to remind you again that all of our guests are here under our non-attribution policy. Whatever they share with us is for our use only. We don't divulge their identities, and whatever they say stays right here in the unit. So be smart, pay attention, and give a big hand to our guest, Mr. X of the Federal Aviation Administration. Beckwith led the applause as our visitor made his way to the front of the classroom. Charlie Beckwith was a master at this sort of thing. He knew our future depended on the goodwill and help of some of the other government agencies, and he was shrewd enough about human nature to know how to go about gaining that support. He invited people from the highest and most influential levels of government to come to the unit for a visit or to be a guest speaker. We took them to the range and the shooting house for live fire demonstrations. Some of them even sat in the hot seat. We let them shoot a few guns and fire off an explosive charge, showed them all sorts of secret stuff, and told them they were one of the few outsiders ever to see any of this. We'd let them share a meal with the guys in the mess hall, swear them, as a new associate member of the unit, to undying secrecy, and send them on their happy way home with excited memories of everything they'd seen and done. Everybody likes to be in on a secret, so by the end of the visit, we would have a new ally. Then, our guest would whisper to a few people about what he had seen and done down with that secret outfit at Fort Bragg, and before long, other people who deemed themselves important would angle for an invitation. This sort of thing paid big dividends for the unit in the years to come, and the reality was we always learned something valuable from our guests. Our current visitor was a case in point. He was a very high-ranking official of the FAA, and the information he gave us about aircraft hijacking incidents and the things air crews were trained to do if hijacked was invaluable. Coupled with what we learned from the FBI's training academy group the following day, we found that there was a very distinct line of demarcation between the authority of the FAA and the FBI when it came to responsibility for a hijacked plane. Very simply put, as long as the doors of the plane were closed, it belonged to the FAA. But once the doors opened, the enforcement of federal airplane piracy law became the responsibility of the FBI. What that really means? Once the plane lands, the FBI takes charge. But in those days, no agency in American law enforcement was prepared to wrest control of an airplane away from an armed and determined terrorist band. The FBI didn't have the training, the manpower, or the organization for the task. Neither did any of the large metropolitan police SWAT teams. Everybody knew there was a glaring problem, but no one was doing anything to address it. Aircraft hijackings had been a growth industry during the 1970s, and any organization that gave it even the slightest study soon realized it was a problem of monumental proportions. Everybody was hoping somebody else would take the lead, and it looked like we would have to be that somebody. During that week in the classroom, we studied every successful example of a Western power taking a plane back from hijackers. It didn't take long. There were only two. The French Counter-Terrorist Service, GIGN, Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale, had resolved a hijacking principally by the fires of their snipers. But a wounded hijacker had killed the commander of the force when he led a detachment onto the plane. In the second instance, the German Federal Police CT Force, GSG-9, Grenzschutzgruppe 9, assisted by two British SAS members, had executed an assault to retake a hijacked Lufthansa 737 that had been flown to Mogadishu, Somalia, in October 1977. Although ultimately a success, the assault could easily have become catastrophic. Once in the plane, the German force got bogged down in a protracted gunfight. During the battle, the terrorist leader, who was in the cockpit, managed to throw 2 hand grenades into the passenger cabin before he was killed. Fortunately, the seats absorbed the worst of the blast and shrapnel. In the official after-action review the Germans shared with us, they freely admitted they had been unprepared for the assault they undertook, and the plan they had put together to retake the plane was ad hoc. Though pleased they had recovered the hostages, they knew they might not be so lucky the next time, There had to be a better method of executing an aircraft assault. Our guys were already at work on the problem. By studying all the terrorist hijackings in the last decade, we determined that there were very few occasions when snipers alone could resolve a situation. But one obstacle for the snipers turned out to be not as large as anticipated. The leader of a hijacking force usually would position himself in the cockpit of the plane. After all, that's the control center. Often enough, other members of the terrorist force would gravitate to the cockpit as well. If the snipers could kill any terrorists located in the cockpit when the assault was initiated, it would greatly enhance the mission's chances of success. But there was a problem. Most sniper units believed that a bullet fired through the extremely thick glass of an airplane cockpit would be deflected enough to cause a miss, or worse, veer off path and hit one of the airplane's crew members. The FBI and Secret Service snipers thought so too, but no one had made any empirical studies of the problem until we came along. We got a truckload of cockpit glass from many different types of aircraft, mounted it in metal frames, and started shooting. Our snipers determined there wasn't much of a problem after all. The deflection was so slight that, within the confines of an airplane's cockpit, it made little difference to the accuracy of the shot. They could hit and kill the terrorists and still leave any crew members in the cockpit unscathed. It even turned out that any glass shattered by the bullet and flying around inside the cockpit had the consistency of sand and presented little danger to the crew. The assaulters were confident we could hit a plane in the same fashion as a building, to enter simultaneously in a violently executed rush through every access point. If we could do that, we could be on top of the terrorists so fast we could overwhelm and kill them before they were able to make an effective response. But how do you get up to a plane without being seen? And how do you get in all at once? How could we divide the plane into areas of responsibility and sectors of fire? And speaking of fire, just how vulnerable was a plane to catching fire during an assault? We planned to answer those and many other questions while we were in Atlanta. So after we had pumped our visitors for all they knew, we spent the rest of the week divided into teams trying to come up with some preliminary tactics. We went out to the shooting house and worked various assault drills. It didn't take long to figure out that by simultaneously entering all the entrances of a plane, we would have some teams moving and shooting directly toward one another, or teams with their backs turned to their mates. We soon realized that while our small 12-row section of fuselage was great for training a single 4-man team, it was far too short for multiple team training. We needed a full-length fuselage to work on these problems. Until we could get access to the real thing, we would have to be content with chalkboard drills. But all in all, a lot of progress was made in those few days, with every member of the tribe focusing attention on killing this mastodon. This is a good example of how operational plans were developed in Delta Force. Beckwith laid down the law early on. Operators would develop their own tactics and operational methods. He had chosen us because we were all experienced fighters, and no one needed to tell us how to go about our business. The men on the teams would determine the how of the mission, and Beckwith and his subordinate commanders would provide assets and coordination. But no one would ever dictate tactics to us or tell us how to risk our own lives. With that as a given, I can tell you that some of our tactics discussions became pretty heated. If you threw an idea on the table during a skull session, you had to be ready to defend it from all sides. But this was the only way we could have gone about developing these ideas. In those early days, everything we did was plowing new ground. There was no tested methodology, and mistaken ideas would be paid for in lives, not just the lives of the hostages we were supposed to rescue, but our own. By the close of business Thursday, we had a few preliminary plans we wanted to work on. Friday morning, we loaded our bags and set out for Atlanta. Later that evening, we loaded into our vans and made the short drive from the hotel to Delta Airlines maintenance hangar on the back side of what is now called Atlanta's Hartsfield International Airport. Our caretaker then, and for many subsequent visits, was Delta Airlines Chief of Security, Mr. Joe Stone. But the tone for the relationship was established by a senior vice president of the company when he greeted us upon our arrival at the hangar and told us we would have any and all support we needed. The reason was simple, he told us. First, it was the right thing to do. And second, it could easily be one of their planes and their passengers and crew we would need to rescue someday. That was an easy statement to make, but Delta Airlines put its money where its mouth was. I have no idea how many tens of thousands of dollars the company sacrificed to lost productivity during our visits. We were always given their two most senior and experienced maintenance men as technical advisors, and any plane in the hangar was at our disposal. They would always have a variety of planes in the hangar, but if we wanted a particular model to rehearse on, they would make it available to us, even if they had to pull one in from another city. We worked with all the other major airlines over the years, but none of them ever showed the concern and enthusiasm for what we were trying to accomplish that Delta Airlines did. Maybe it had something to do with sharing a family name. We started by learning ground operations. We got to drive baggage trucks and tug motors, load and unload baggage from all types of planes, drive fuel trucks and refuel airplanes, and crank up and operate ground power units, GPUs, the trailer-mounted jet engines that blow air into and crank a plane's engines. Our favorite ground job of them all was operating the SST, the shit-sucking truck, the all-important vehicle that pumps out the toilets. Trust me, if you are ever on a plane that's taken hostage and held for more than a day, you'll cheer the arrival of the SST more than the rescue team. By learning to fill the ground positions that care for the airplanes, we became comfortable on the busy flight lines and adept at blending into the environment of an airport. We spent several hours in the wheel, tire, and brake shop and discovered something that blew one of our theories. Shooting out a plane's tires wouldn't be much, if any, help in an assault. Not only could jet planes still taxi around with blown tires, the damn things could even take off. They have that much power. But there was another vulnerability we found that would allow us to immobilize a plane, and that immediately went into our growing playbook. Then we got inside the planes, all kinds of them. First, the narrow bodies, 707s and DC-8s, 727s, 737s, and DC-9s. We even snagged a few Convair turboprops that were still in service. Then we tackled the wide-body planes Delta flew, the giant Boeing 747 and the Lockheed L-1011. We became familiar with their internal layouts, the locations of their emergency equipment, and areas of particular danger, such as the routing of fuel and oxygen lines. Aircraft doors became an obsession. We learned how to operate the doors of each plane, not just from the inside, but what was more important, from the outside. It was imperative that we be able to rapidly open any door or emergency exit. We had to know how to get into any plane in the blink of an eye, and we quickly learned how to go about it. The next problem was what to do when we got in. In practice, we found this to be less of a problem than we had anticipated. From our point of view, the passenger compartments, cockpit, and galley areas of an airplane weren't very different from the rooms in a building, excepting that an airplane was absolutely crammed with people. But tactically, we could clear a plane in almost the same manner as we approached a building. Even though the plane would be filled with hostages, of necessity most of them would be down in their seats. And as we found out through experimentation, the seats of an airplane are extremely tough and offer great protection from gunfire and shrapnel. Locked cockpit and lavatory doors also proved to be no problem. We found a way to get through those like there was no lock on them.
And that was the next part of Preparing the Force from Inside Delta Force by Eric L. Haney, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.